The rain fell in soft, steady sheets, coating the ground in a slick, glistening film inside a parked police cruiser on a deserted street officer. Ryan Mitchell adjusted his tactical vest, stealing a glance at his partner. Charlie, the German shepherd, sat upright in the passenger seat, his piercing eyes scanning their surroundings. They had answered countless calls together, but something about this one felt different. There was a weight to the dispatcher's voice that Ryan couldn't ignore, a sense of urgency that settled deep in his gut. Unit 12. We have reports of suspicious activity. At the old warehouse on Western Drive, possible presence of armed individuals. Proceed with caution. Backup is on. He wrote. Crackled the radio. Ryan exhaled deeply, reaching out to give Charlie a reassuring pat on the head. Just us for now. Buddy, stay sharp. Charlie let out a low, approving sound, his entire body taut and ready. The warehouse loomed large against the pitch black sky, its peeling walls and rusted doors towering like silent giants. Rain dripped from cracked shingles above the rhythmic plinking echoing eerily in the night. Ryan moved cautiously, his weapon drawn, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Charlie walked close at his side, sniffing the damp air, his ears twitching with every distant noise. Suddenly, Ryan froze. Footsteps, hurried, yet muffled, echoed faintly from within the structure. Raising his fist, he signaled Charlie to halt. The silence that followed was deafening. Then it happened. A sharp, metallic clatter rang out, something falling and rolling across the concrete floor, before Ryan could fully process the sound. A searing pain exploded through his left side. He staggered backward, his vision flickering as he struggled to stay upright. His hand, instinctive, went to his side, and when he pulled it away, it was slick with blood, with knees buckling. He collapsed to the wet ground, the world around him spinning. Charlie didn't budge. The dog stood like a statue next to his fallen partner, his gaze locked on the shadows ahead. That's when they emerged. 3 figures silhouetted against the faint light spilling from a distant street lamp. One of them held something in his hand, while the other 2 whispered among themselves. Their voice is low, but sinister. Ryan tried to speak, his voice a weak rasp. Charlie, stay. But the shepherd didn't flinch. He let out a deep, guttural growl, a warning that he was ready to protect, no matter the cost. As Ryan's strength faded, Charlie faced the 3 men alone. What the loyal canine did next would not only change the course of that night, but reveal the unbreakable bond between a police officer and his partner. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming on the pavement as Charlie stood his ground. His paws were firm on the slick surface. His ears pinned back in focus, Ryan lay just a few feet away, his breath shallow, the crimson stain on his uniform growing larger with each passing second. He tried to lift his head to see what was happening, but his strength was fading quickly. All he could hear was the low, steady growl from Charlie, a sound that carried both warning and unwavering determination. The figures stepped closer, their boots splashing in the puddles as they exchanged uncertain glances. "It's just a dog," one of them muttered, though his tone betrayed doubt. Charlie's growl deepened at the words, his posture lowering defensively, as if ready to spring. His eyes darted between the men, reading every twitch, every move, while the rain continued to fall, making the tension almost unbearable. One of the men moved first, stepping toward Charlie with slow, deliberate steps. His hand reached out in a gesture of feigned confidence, but his hesitation was evident. Charlie didn't retreat. Instead, he held his position, his sharp eyes locked on the man's every move. The man paused for a second, then looked over his shoulder. "We don't have time for this. Grab the cop and let's go hearing this." Ryan mustered every ounce of strength he had. He tried to reach for his radio, his hand trembling as it brushed against the wet ground. "Charlie," he whispered, barely audible. But the dog's ears twitched at the sound of his name. The connection between them had always been unspoken, one of trust, loyalty, and an unbreakable bond. Charlie's growl intensified, almost as if responding to Ryan's silent plea. The men hesitated, clearly, unnerved by Charlie's unwavering stance. One of them gestured toward the others. "Forget it. Let's go." But before they could make a move, the distant sound of sirens broke through the rain-soaked silence. It was faint, but it was enough. The men exchanged frantic glances, their plan unraveling under the pressure of time, running out as the figures retreated into the darkness. Charlie stayed rooted in the place, ensuring they were gone. Before turning his full attention to Ryan, he moved quickly to his partner's side, his wet fur rushing against Ryan's arm. Despite his exhaustion, Ryan managed a faint smile as he reached out weakly to touch Charlie's neck. The sirens grew louder, signaling help was finally on the way. Charlie remained by Ryan's side, his presence a silent promise he would stay no matter what. The arrival of backup would bring help, but Charlie's actions that night would leave an impression no one would soon forget. What happened next would cement the bond between a man and his dog, a bond forged in loyalty and bravery. The flashing lights of the backup units finally cut through the darkness. Their red and blue beams dancing across the rain-soaked pavement, officers spilled out of their vehicles, weapons drawn scanning the area for threats. Charlie stayed protectively close to Ryan, his fur matted with rain, but his eyes still sharp and alert. He growled low at the sight of strangers approaching, his loyalty unshaken despite his exhaustion. Officer Down, one of the first responders, called into his radio. As he rushed to Ryan's side, the officer knelt down, his gloved hands quickly assessing the wound. "Stay with us, Mitchell," he urged. Ryan's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, and his gaze immediately shifted to Charlie. Even in his weakened state, he tried to speak. "Charlie saved me." He mumbled his words, barely audible over the commotion. As paramedics arrived, Charlie reluctantly stepped back, his ears flat against his head as they worked to stabilize Ryan. "An officer." Grant crouched beside Charlie, speaking softly. "It's okay, boy. We've got him now." But Charlie didn't move far. His eyes stayed locked on Ryan, watching every movement as if he understood the gravity of the situation. The paramedics worked quickly, applying pressure to Ryan's wound and lifting him onto a stretcher. "He's critical, but he's got a chance," one of them said as they loaded him into the ambulance. Charlie tried to jump in after them, his paws scraping against the slick metal, but an officer gently held him back. "Easy, Charlie. He's in good hands now." Charlie whined softly, pacing anxiously as the ambulance pulled away with Ryan inside. The other officers remained on high alert, spreading out to search the area for the suspects. They couldn't have gotten far. Grant said, his voice steady but tense. He glanced at Charlie, who was still restless, his sharp instincts clearly sensing the unfinished danger. As the minutes ticked by, another officer approached Charlie with a leash, hoping to calm him. But before the leash could be secured, Charlie froze, his ears perking up. A faint noise, the crunch of gravel underfoot, caught his attention. The officers hadn't noticed it yet, but Charlie had he let out a low, urgent bark. His body, turning toward the shadows Grant's eyes, followed the dog's lead, his hand instinctively going to his holstered weapon. "What is it, Charlie?" he asked. The dog's reaction left no doubt. The danger wasn't over yet, as the officers prepared to follow Charlie's lead. The tension in the air thickened. Whatever Charlie had sensed in the shadows would bring them face to face with the threat Ryan barely escaped. The officers exchanged tense glances as Charlie's bark cut through the damp night air. His stance was rigid, his ears pinned forward and his gaze fixed on the dark expanse beyond the warehouse. Officer Grant tightened his grip on his flashlight, his other hand resting on his holstered weapon spread out. "But stay, alert," he ordered the others, his voice steady but low. "If Charlie's on to something, we need to trust him." Charlie moved cautiously toward the edge of the lot, his nose low to the ground as he tracked a scent rain, slicked his coat. But his movements were precise, deliberate. Grant followed close behind, his flashlight beam cutting through the misty air. The gravel crunched beneath their boots as the group pressed forward, their nerves on edge. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound, amplified by the silence around them. "Got something over here," one officer called from near the side of the warehouse. Charlie head snapped in the direction of the voice, and he darted forward, his tail straight like a flag, signaling focus Grant, and the others followed quickly, their adrenaline spiking as they reached a partially open door. The faint glow of a flashlight revealed footprints in the mud leading inside. Grant motioned for silence, gesturing for the team to fan out. Charlie was the first to step through the door, his paws landing silently on the concrete floor. The interior of the W warehouse was dark, the air thick with the smell of oil and mildew. Charlie's movements were careful but determined, his nose working overtime as he followed the scent trail deeper into the shadows. Then a noise, faint but distinct, a scuffle of feet, a whispered curse. Grant raised his hand, signaling the team to stop. Charlie froze in place, his ears twitching as he zeroed in on the source. The tension was palpable, every second dragging out as they waited for something, anything to happen. Suddenly, a figure bolted from behind a stack of crates running towards the far exit stop. "Police!" Grant shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Charlie didn't hesitate. With a burst of speed, he charged after the suspect, his powerful strides closing the distance in seconds. The suspect glanced over his shoulder, panic flashing across his face as he realized he couldn't outrun the determined K9 as Charlie closed in on the fleeing suspect. The officers prepared to intercept. What happened next would prove just how vital the bond between man and dog could be in the face of danger. The sound of pounding footsteps echoed through the vast warehouse as Charlie closed in on the fleeing suspect. The man's panic was evident. His heavy breathing and desperate glances over his shoulder betrayed his growing fear. Charlie's strides were relentless, his body low and streamlined as he chased his target behind him. Officer Grant and the team moved swiftly, their shouts commanding the man to stop, but it was Charlie who was leading the charge. The suspect reached the far exit and yanked at the door, but it jammed halfway, scraping loudly against the concrete. The delay was all Charlie needed. With one powerful leap, he was on the man's heels, his commanding bark filling the air like a warning. The suspect froze his hands instinctively, rising as if surrendering would somehow plate the determined K9. Charlie stood firm, growling, low, his piercing eyes locked on the man. Grant and the other officers reached them. Seconds later, weapons drawn. "Don't move," Grant ordered, his voice sharp and unwavering. The suspect dropped to his knees, his hands still raised as the officers moved in to secure him. Charlie remained in position, his growl subsiding slightly, but his focus unbroken only when Grant clipped the man's wrists with handcuffs. Did Charlie step back? His job done for now. As the officers began to question the suspect, another sound caught Charlie's attention. A faint rustling coming from deeper inside the warehouse. His ears perked up, and his head turned sharply toward the noise Grant noticed immediately. "What is it, Charlie?" he asked. But the dog didn't wait for a command. He began moving, his pace quick and deliberate. Grant signaled to the rest of the team, who followed Charlie as he led them toward the far end of the building. The air grew colder, the faint hum of machinery mixing with the sound of dripping water from the leaky roof. They reached an old storage room, the door slightly ajar. Charlie stopped just outside, sniffing intensely with a low bark. He stepped back and looked at Grant as if signaling for the humans to proceed. The officers opened the door carefully, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Inside, they found the second suspect crouched behind a stack of broken pallets, clutching a makeshift weapon. "Hands where we can see them," one officer shouted. The man hesitated for a moment, then dropped the object with a clang, raising his hands in defeat as the officers moved in to detain him. Charlie stood nearby, watching intently. Even after two suspects were in custody, his posture remained alert. Something in his body language told the team the night wasn't over yet. Charlie's instincts had already proven invaluable, but as the team prepared to leave the loyal K9 sense, something still wasn't right. A discovery that would reveal an even greater threat. The tension in the air hadn't eased. Even with two suspects detained, Charlie's body language told the officers everything they needed to know. This wasn't over. His sharp eyes darted around the warehouse, his ears twitching with every faint sound. Officer Grant crouched down beside him, speaking in a calm tone. "What is it, boy? You've got something, haven't you?" Charlie let out a soft, determined bark and turned his head toward the darkened loading bay at the back of the warehouse. Grant signaled to the team, "Stay sharp." "Charlie's onto something." The officers moved carefully, their flashlights illuminating the scattered debris and rusted machinery that littered the space. Charlie led the way, his nose low to the ground as he tracked a scent that seemed to grow stronger. With every step the rain outside had slowed, but the warehouse roof continued to drip each drop, echoing ominously in the stillness as they approached the loading bay. Charlie stopped abruptly, his body stiff. A low growl rumbled from his throat, and his eyes locked onto a large metal container pushed against the far wall. The container was dented and rusted, with its lid slightly ajar. The officers exchanged wary glances. "That doesn't feel right," one of them murmured, gripping his flashlight tighter. Grant stepped forward cautiously, his weapon drawn. "Cover me," he instructed the others with deliberate care. He used the tip of his flashlight to nudge the lid open wider inside. He found something that made his stomach drop, a small cache of weapons, and a bag filled with what appeared to be cash and IDs. "Looks like they were planning something bigger," he muttered, stepping back to let the others take a look. But before anyone could process the discovery, a sudden noise erupted from above, the sharp creak of metal, followed by the unmistakable sound of movement. Charlie reacted, first barking loudly and lunging toward the source of the sound. The officers pointed their flashlights upward, catching a glimpse of a third suspect perched on a steel beam. The man had been hiding, waiting for the perfect moment to strike up there. Grant shouted, as the man moved quickly, leaping down onto a stack of crates in an attempt to escape. Charlie was faster, before the suspect could make a full run for it. The K-9 intercepted him, blocking his path with a commanding bark. The man hesitated, clearly shaken by the dog's ferocity. The officers closed in, surrounding him with weapons drawn, realizing he had no way out. The man slowly raised his hands, his face pale with defeat. With all suspects in custody, the officers thought the night was finally over. But what they uncovered in the hidden stash would lead to a revelation far bigger than they had anticipated, with the third suspect secured. The tension in the warehouse began to ease, but Charlie's vigilance remained unbroken. Officer Grant glanced down at the dog, who was still fixated on the container they had opened moments earlier. "What else is there, boy?" he murmured, crouching beside Charlie. The dog sniffed the air again, then turned back to the container, letting out a soft but insistent bark. Grant exchanged a glance with one of the officers. "Let's take a closer look," he said, pulling on gloves as he carefully lifted the remaining contents from the container. What he found made his stomach twist beneath the weapons, and cash was a folder worn and water-stained, filled with documents and maps. He spread them out on a nearby crate, using his flashlight to examine them. The markings on the maps showed multiple locations across the city, each circled and annotated with dates. This wasn't just a robbery. Grant said, his voice grim. They were planning something much bigger. These locations, their key infrastructure points. This could have been catastrophic. The weight of the discovery hung heavy in the air, as the officers silently took in the implications. Charlie, sensing the unease, let out another low growl, as though he too understood the gravity of what they'd stumbled upon. The detained suspects were LED out of the warehouse one by one, their faces a mixture of anger and defeat. The third man, the one who had been hiding on the beams, sneered. As he was pushed into the back of a squad car, "You think this stops anything?" He spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Grant didn't respond, but his jaw tightened as he closed the car door back in the warehouse. Charlie stayed close to Grant as the remaining officers bagged the evidence. If it weren't for him, one officer said, nodding toward Charlie, "We might have walked right past all of this. Who knows how long it would have been before we realized what they were planning." Grant looked down at Charlie and scratched behind his ears. "HEK more than a partner," Grant said softly, "and the reason we're all walking out of here tonight," as they prepared to leave the scene. Grant took a final look around the warehouse, the weight of the night settling heavily on his shoulders. Charlie sat beside him, his posture relaxed now, but his eyes still scanning their surroundings. "You did good, buddy," Grant said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Ryan's lucky to have you. We all are." With one last glance at the darkened warehouse, the team loaded up the evidence and began their journey back to the station, knowing that Charlie had not only saved lives that night, but also uncovered a plot that could have devastated their city. As the team left the warehouse behind, the full scope of what they had uncovered began to take shape. But the danger wasn't fully over yet. A new challenge awaited, and once again, Charlie would prove to be an irreplaceable hero. The early hours of the morning brought a strange calm to the station as the officers returned with the suspects, and the evidence rain still tapped against the windows. But inside, there was an air of tension as the team began piecing together the full scope of the plot they had uncovered. Charlie walked beside Grant, his tail swaying slightly, now that the immediate danger had passed, but his keen eyes never stopped observing the flurry of activity around him. The evidence was spread across a long table in the station's briefing room. The maps, documents, and weapons painted a chilling picture. The circled locations on the maps weren't random. They included key bridges, a power substation, and even a hospital. The dates matched upcoming public events times when these places would be crowded. Grant leaned over the table, his hands resting on the edge. They were planning a coordinated attack, he said quietly, his voice heavy. Captain Morales entered the room, her expression grave. This isn't just a local matter anymore. I've already contacted the federal authorities. They'll be here by noon to take over. She paused, glancing down at Charlie, who sat dutifully by Grant's side and make sure someone puts in accommodation for this dog without him. We wouldn't have uncovered any of this in time. Grant nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He's the real hero tonight, he said, scratching Charlie's neck affectionately. Meanwhile, Ryan's condition remained critical but stable. The officers who had visited the hospital reported back that he was responsive but weak, his first words being a question about Charlie Grant. Knew he had to visit Ryan soon, but there was still work to be done. Charlie, however, seemed to sense something. He whined softly, as if missing his partner. "You'll see him soon." Grant assured the dog the suspects now. In separate interrogation rooms, refused to speak. One of them, the man who had hidden on the warehouse beam, simply smirked when questioned. "You stopped us night," he said coolly, "but you're too late to stop everything." His cryptic words sent a chill through the room. Grant clenched his fists, but kept his composure. He glanced at Charlie, who stood near the door. His head tilted, as though he too sensed the tension. As the hour stretched on, the team worked tirelessly cross, referencing the evidence with known associates of the suspects and sending urgent updates to federal agencies. Every officer knew the clock was ticking for now. They had stopped one part of a dangerous plan, but the suspect's warning lingered ominously in the back of everyone's minds. Charlie stayed close to Grant, his unwavering presence, reminding everyone that sometimes the most vital protector came on 4 legs, not 2. Just as the team thought they had contained the threat, a new lead emerged, one that would send them racing against the clock yet again, with Charlie once more at the forefront of their mission. The mood in the station shifted abruptly when an analyst rushed into the briefing room, clutching a newly decoded piece of evidence. "We missed something," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. She spread a map across the table, pointing to a location that hadn't been marked before, a shipping yard on the outskirts of town. One of the documents mentioned a delivery scheduled for this morning. If we're right, they might have been planning to move explosives or weapons to another location. Officer Grant felt his stomach tighten. The suspect's cryptic warning now made sense. The plot wasn't over. "How much time do we have?" he asked. The analyst glanced at her watch. "If the timing in the document is accurate, less than an hour." Grant turned to Charlie, who stood by his side, his ears perked up as if ready to move. "Let's go," Grant said firmly. He gathered his team, and within minutes they were speeding toward the shipping yard. With sirens blaring when they arrived, the yard was eerily quiet. The massive shipping containers standing like monoliths under the gray morning sky. Grant stepped out of the car, scanning the area. As Charlie jumped down beside him, the dog's nose went to work immediately. Sniffing the air as he led the team toward the heart of the yard, the officers moved information, their eyes darting between the towering stacks of containers, each step echoing ominously on the concrete ground. Charlie stopped suddenly near a cluster of containers, his body stiff and his nose pressed to the ground. He barked sharply, signaling the team to focus on one particular container. Grant motioned for the officers to secure the area. as he inspected the container. The lock had been broken, and the door was slightly ajar. Grant pulled it open cautiously, revealing a chilling sight, crates filled with materials that could be used to make explosives. It was a cache, and they had found it. Just in time as the team worked quickly to secure the evidence, a shout came from one of the officers stationed nearby. "We've got movement from the far side of the yard." Two figures bolted from behind a stack of containers, attempting to escape. Charlie didn't hesitate. With a burst of energy, he took off in pursuit, his speed unmatched. As he closed the gap between himself and the fleeing suspects, Grant and the others followed, but it was clear Charlie would reach them first, with the suspects' core cord and the cache secured. The final moments of the mission would test the courage of both man and dog, leading to a conclusion that no one would forget. Charlie surged ahead, his focus locked on the fleeing suspects. As they weaved through the maze of shipping containers, the officers followed close behind, their boots pounding against the wet concrete. But it was clear Charlie was the fastest among them. His bark rang out sharp and commanding, as if warning the suspects that there was nowhere left to run. The two men glanced back in panic, realizing they had underestimated the determined K-91 of the suspect stumbled, losing his footing on the slippery ground. Charlie reached him within seconds, standing guard over him, and barking to alert the officers. The man froze, raising his hands in surrender as the officers moved in to detain him, but the second suspect didn't stop. He darted toward a truck parked near the edge of the yard, desperation driving him to make one last attempt at escape. Grant shouted Charlie, "Go!" and the dog bolted toward the truck with relentless speed. The suspect clambered into the cab, fumbling with the keys, but before he could start the engine, Charlie leapt onto the running board, barking fiercely. The sound startled the man, who dropped the keys in his panic. Grant and the other officers arrived moments later, pulling the suspect out of the truck and placing him under arrest. The scene finally settled into an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of distant sirens as backup arrived. As the suspects were escorted away, Grant crouched down to Charlie, who was panting but alert, his tail wagging slightly. "You did it, buddy," Grant said, his voice filled with pride. "You stopped them." Charlie leaned into Grant's hand as he scratched behind his ears, the bond between them stronger than ever. Nearby, the officers secured the cache of explosives, ensuring that the dangerous materials would never reach their intended targets. By the time they returned to the station, word of Charlie's actions had spread. Officers gathered to greet the returning team, offering applause and pats on the back for both the officers and their K-9 hero. Later that day, Grant took Charlie to visit Ryan in the hospital. Though weak, Ryan managed to smile as Charlie entered the room, his tail wagging. "Fury, lie, you saved my life, boy." Ryan murmured, his hand reaching out to stroke Charlie's fur. The dog nuzzled his partner gently, a silent promise that he would always protect him. No matter the danger, the mission was over. The suspects apprehended and the city safe, all thanks to the courage of one incredible K-9. Charlie's actions would be remembered not only as heroic, but as a testament to the unbreakable bond between man and dog.